I still remember the weight of the envelope in my hands. My parents handed me a $240,000 bill at my wedding, smiled and said, "Now pay us for raising you." For a few endless seconds, the reception hall fell so quiet that I could hear the ice clink against crystal glasses. Every guest was staring at me. My new spouse froze beside me, fingers still wrapped around mine. Even the string quartet stopped playing. My mother's smile never wavered. Every school payment, every doctor's appointment, every birthday, every meal. "We kept records," she announced loudly enough for every relative to hear. "You're married now. It's time to repay your debt." My father folded his arms, looking almost proud, as if presenting an invoice. To his own child in front of 200 guests was the most natural thing in the world. Someone near the back laughed nervously. Someone else whispered, "Is this some kind of joke?" I looked down at the thick stack of neatly printed pages. Every expense was itemized with obsessive precision. Diapers, textbooks, piano lessons, electricity, even the food I'd eaten as a teenager. At the bottom, in bold letters, was a single sentence. Payable immediately. They had even included interest. My chest tightened, but not because of the money, because this wasn't spontaneous. They had planned this humiliation for months. The photographer kept snapping pictures, assuming this was another emotional wedding tradition. Instead, he was capturing the moment. My parents publicly transformed 28 years of parenthood into a business transaction. I could feel dozens of eyes waiting for my reaction. Would I cry? Would I argue? Would I beg? My mother reached for the microphone before I could speak. "We sacrificed everything," she declared dramatically. "Children today think parents owe them everything. Today our son finally learns that nothing in life is free." A few distant relatives nodded politely, believing only her version of the story. What they didn't know was that this wasn't the first bill my parents had handed me. Growing up, every mistake had a price. Every act of kindness came with conditions. Every achievement became another excuse to remind me how much I supposedly owed them. Love was never freely given. It was carefully measured, recorded, and eventually weaponized. They expected me to break under the pressure. Instead, I quietly folded the invoice and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I looked toward the ballroom entrance. My lawyer had been standing there the entire time, holding another envelope sealed with deep red wax. It was my grandfather's final letter. He waited exactly 30 seconds before stepping forward. And in that moment, everything my parents believed they controlled began to collapse. I wasn't the rebellious child my parents liked to describe. I was the quiet one, the son who apologized first, worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and believed that if I loved them enough, one day they would love me without conditions. That day never came. My father believed respect had to be earned through obedience, while my mother treated affection like a reward. She could give or withhold depending on how useful I was to her plans. Every achievement became their achievement. Every failure became my character flaw. If I earned a scholarship, they reminded everyone how much they had sacrificed. If I bought something with my own paycheck, they claimed it was only possible because they had invested in me. By the time I reached adulthood, I had stopped expecting praise. Peace was enough. I built a successful career quietly, avoided unnecessary arguments, and kept my finances private because I had learned that every personal victory somehow became another reason for them to demand more. They assumed my silence meant weakness. In reality, silence had become my strongest defense. The only person who truly saw me was my grandfather. He never interrupted when I spoke, never turned conversations into lectures, and never kept score of what he had done for me. More importantly, he noticed things other people missed, how I smiled to avoid conflict, how I accepted blame just to keep family dinners from exploding, and how I carried disappointments without ever complaining. Before he passed away, he squeezed my hand and told me, "The loudest people usually believe they control the ending. Let them think that." I didn't fully understand what he meant until my wedding day. My parents believed they had spent years writing the story of my life, with me trapped as the obedient son who would always surrender. They had no idea my grandfather had quietly written the final chapter, himself, and trusted me to open it only when the truth could no longer be ignored. The weeks leading up to the wedding felt strangely rehearsed, as though my parents were following a script that only they understood. Every conversation carried a quiet edge. My mother would smile warmly in front of guests, then lean close when no one was listening and ask, "You're not forgetting everything we've done for you, are you?" Her voice was soft, almost affectionate, but it always left me feeling as though I had signed an invisible contract. My father found subtler ways to remind me where he believed I belonged. During venue tours, He introduced me to vendors as the boy who still owes us more than he'll ever know. Most people laughed politely, assuming it was a harmless joke. I laughed too, because correcting him would have turned a pleasant afternoon into another family argument. Even small decisions became quiet contests. When my spouse and I chose simple decorations instead of expensive displays, my mother sighed just loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear. "Some people only appreciate quality when their parents pay for it," she murmured, never looking directly at me. The comment floated through the room like perfume, light enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. Relatives began repeating little remarks I knew hadn't started with them. They asked whether I planned to finally repay my parents after the wedding, smiling as though it were family humor. I realized someone had been planting those ideas long before the ceremony. Each sideways glance, each carefully timed pause, each disguised joke pointed towards something larger. My parents weren't simply embarrassing me in passing. They were patiently preparing an audience, making sure that when the real performance began, everyone would already believe I deserved whatever happened next. So I stopped defending myself. Instead, I watched quietly, remembering my grandfather's last advice. Sometimes the strongest response isn't interrupting the performance. It's letting the actors believe the stage belongs entirely to them. Until the curtain falls. When my lawyer stepped into the center of the ballroom, with my grandfather's sealed letter, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. For years, I had imagined confronting my parents, proving them wrong, exposing every lie they had told about me. But standing there in my wedding suit, surrounded by friends, relatives, and strangers, I understood that none of those things would change who they were. The only thing I could control was whether I allowed this moment to define the rest of my life. My father broke the silence first. "Well?" he asked, tapping the invoice with one finger. "Are you paying it or not?" His voice carried just enough confidence to suggest he already knew the answer. My mother folded her hands together, wearing the patient smile she always used when she believed I was about to surrender. Around the room, guests exchanged uncertain glances. Some looked at me with sympathy, others looked away, uncomfortable enough to pretend they weren't listening. I slowly placed the invoice on the head table without signing it. "No," I said quietly. It wasn't loud, but it was the first time I had ever refused them without apology or explanation. For a brief second, my parents looked genuinely confused. They were used to arguments, excuses, and compromises. They weren't prepared for calm certainty. My lawyer stepped forward and held up the wax-sealed envelope. "This letter," he said evenly, "was left by your grandfather with strict legal instructions. It was to remain unopened until someone attempted to demand financial repayment from his grandson for being raised." A ripple of disbelief moved through the room. My mother's smile faltered. My father's confident posture stiffened. Only then did I understand what my grandfather had meant years ago. He hadn't asked me to defeat my parents through anger or revenge. He had simply asked me to wait until they revealed themselves without my help. They had just done exactly that. As my lawyer carefully broke the seal, every eye in the ballroom shifted away from me and toward the letter. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one on trial. They were. Most people assumed the letter contained a dramatic confession or a hidden fortune. It contained neither. Months before his death, my grandfather had called me to his study. He knew his health was failing, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. He had spent 40 years as a contract attorney, and experience had taught him that family conflicts were rarely settled by emotion. They were settled by preparation, documentation, and patience. He asked me only one question. "If the day comes when your parents try to turn love into a financial transaction, will you promise not to react in anger?" I promised. He smiled, handed my lawyer a sealed packet of legal instructions, and made him swear it would remain untouched unless my parents publicly demanded repayment for raising me. It wasn't a trap, it was a safeguard. He believed people eventually revealed their true character if no one interrupted them. After his passing, I never mentioned the letter again. My lawyer quietly confirmed that every document had been notarized, witnessed, and stored securely. We reviewed the instructions only once to ensure everything would be handled exactly as my grandfather intended. Then we waited. When my parents began making those strange comments before the wedding, my lawyer called me. "They're moving towards something," he said calmly. "Don't confront them. If they're following the pattern your grandfather predicted, they'll expose themselves without realizing it." So I stayed silent. I answered every insult with courtesy. I refused to argue. I let them believe I was embarrassed and cornered. Every quiet smile they mistook for surrender gave them more confidence to continue. Standing in that ballroom, watching my lawyer carefully unfold the first page of my grandfather's letter, I knew the hardest part of my revenge was already over. I hadn't defeated my parents by outshouting them. I had defeated them by giving them exactly enough time to reveal who they had always been. My lawyer unfolded the first page with unhurried precision. He didn't raise his voice or try to command the room. The silence did that for him. He began reading my grandfather's words. If this letter has been opened, then my son and daughter-in-law have demanded payment for the ordinary duties of parenthood. Should that happen, they have willingly revealed that they viewed raising a child as an investment, not an act of love. A murmur spread across the ballroom. My parents tried to interrupt, but my lawyer calmly lifted a hand. There is more. He placed a second document beside the letter. It was a notarized agreement bearing my grandfather's signature. Years earlier, he had quietly established a family trust that contained nearly all of his estate. The trust included one condition that no one except my lawyer and I had ever seen. Any beneficiary who publicly attempted to financially exploit or coerce another family member for personal gain would immediately forfeit their inheritance. Their share would be permanently transferred to the family education foundation my grandfather had created in my name. The color drained from my father's face. My mother whispered, "That can't be legal. It has already been reviewed and validated," my lawyer replied evenly. No one applauded. No one celebrated. The room simply changed. Guests who had nodded along with my parents, minutes earlier, slowly stepped away from them. Conversations stopped. Expressions softened as people looked toward me, not with pity this time, but with understanding. I quietly folded the ridiculous $240,000 invoice and placed it on the table beside the trust documents. "I don't want your money," I said. I never did. I only wanted parents who didn't keep receipts for loving their child. Neither of them answered. For the first time in my life, they had nothing left to say. And somehow, that silence was worth far more than any inheritance ever could. No one rushed toward my parents after that. The ballroom remained quiet, but it was no longer the uncomfortable silence that had followed the invoice. It was the silence people fall into when something they believed about a family suddenly no longer makes sense. Relatives who had spent years repeating my parents' version of events lowered their eyes. A few approached me privately, apologizing for never asking my side of the story. They admitted they had mistaken my silence for guilt when, in reality, it had been restraint. Several guests left their seats and came to congratulate my spouse and me, not because of the inheritance or the trust, but because the wedding had finally become about us instead of the spectacle my parents had tried to create. The photographer quietly resumed taking pictures, capturing genuine smiles instead of forced ones. Those became the photographs we framed at home. My parents walked out before the reception ended. No one stopped them. No one chased after them. The attention they had worked so hard to control had disappeared the moment the truth became impossible to ignore. In the weeks that followed, word spread through the family exactly as I knew it would. I never posted about the incident online or tried to defend myself. I didn't have to. The witnesses did that without being asked. Reputation built on appearances is fragile. Reputation built on consistent character has a way of surviving even the loudest accusations. The greatest consequence wasn't losing my parents' approval, it was realizing I had never truly possessed it to begin with. Once I accepted that, their opinions no longer determined my worth. That's why moments like these matter. Many people spend years trying to earn love from those who measure every kindness like a debt. But real love doesn't keep invoices. It doesn't wait for the perfect moment to collect payment. The people who truly care about you never make you feel as though your existence is something you have to repay. The months after the wedding were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public arguments, and no desperate attempts to pull me back into the old pattern. My parents reached out a few times through distant relatives, always avoiding the words, "I'm sorry." They wanted the relationship to return to normal, without acknowledging what had happened. For the first time in my life, I understood that forgiveness and access were not the same thing. I chose peace over pretense. My spouse and I settled into a life built on something I had rarely experienced growing up: consistency. Our home became a place where mistakes were met with conversation, instead of scorekeeping, where kindness wasn't recorded as leverage for some future argument. Every ordinary day felt extraordinary because it was free from the fear of disappointing someone who could never be satisfied. My grandfather's education foundation grew steadily over the following years, watching young people receive scholarships from a trust that had once been meant to reward. Manipulation felt like the most fitting tribute to the man, who believed character always outlasted performance. His final gift wasn't the inheritance itself. It was the freedom to stop chasing approval that was never mine to earn. Sometimes people ask whether I regret not paying the invoice just to avoid the conflict. I always smile. The bill was never about money. It was about whether I believed my value could be measured by someone else's ledger. On my wedding day, my parents handed me an invoice. My grandfather handed me the truth. I kept the letter. I burned the bill. And from the ashes of that single piece of paper, I finally built the family I had spent my entire life searching for.